Hey, family. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. There's someone else. Alexander didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't pace the room, didn't hesitate long enough to suggest doubt. The words came out steady, controlled, like he had already practiced them in his head before letting them exist out loud. Across from him, Jasmine sat still, not frozen, not shocked, just still. The city stretched behind them, through the glass walls of the penthouse, lights flickering across Washington, D.C., like nothing in the world had shifted. Cars moved, people lived, somewhere, someone laughed. But inside that room, something had just ended, or at least, that's what Alexander thought, because Jasmine didn't react the way she was supposed to. No sharp inhale, no trembling hands, no questions. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief second, there was something unreadable in her eyes. Not confusion, not pain, recognition. And then, she smiled, small, controlled, almost polite, the kind of smile that didn't belong in a moment like this. Alexander's brow tightened slightly. Not anger, not yet. Confusion. Did you hear what I said? He asked, watching her carefully now. Jasmine nodded once, calm as ever. I did. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. It didn't fall. It stayed exactly where it was, steady enough to make the silence around them feel heavier. And that's when something unfamiliar crept into Alexander's chest, because this wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had prepared for resistance, for emotion, for something he could respond to, something he could manage. But this quiet, this composure, this smile, it shifted the ground beneath him in a way he couldn't explain. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving his face, as if she were studying something she had already figured out long ago. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without moving too much, without doing anything dramatic at all, she took control of the room, not loudly, not aggressively, but completely. And Alexander felt it. He just didn't understand it yet. Now, pause for a second, not for the story, for yourself, because moments like this, they don't just live on screens. They happen in real life, more often than people admit. What would you do if the person you built a life with looked you in the eye and told you they had chosen someone else, and instead of your heart breaking, you felt something else? Not denial, not panic, but clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't arrive suddenly, but settles in quietly, long before the truth is spoken. Have you ever felt that? That subtle shift in someone's energy before anything was said out loud. When conversations started to feel shorter, when eye contact didn't last as long, when their presence was there, but something about them wasn't. It's not loud. It's not obvious. There's no announcement, no clear sign pointing at the moment things change, but you feel it. And the hardest part, you don't always react right away. Sometimes, you watch, you listen a little closer. You notice patterns most people would ignore, because deep down, something in you already knows, not everything, but enough to stop asking certain questions, enough to stop expecting certain answers, enough to prepare, without even realizing you're preparing. That's where Jasmine was, not in shock, not caught off guard. She wasn't sitting in that chair trying to understand what had just been said. She had already understood it, long before Alexander found the words. And that changes everything, because when the truth finally shows up, it doesn't hit the same way. It doesn't break you. It confirms you. And in that moment, you're no longer reacting to what's happening. You're responding from what you already know. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because this wasn't just about a man confessing, and it wasn't just about a woman choosing not to react. There was someone else in the middle of all this, someone who believed she had stepped into something new. Something better. Vanessa. In her world, things made sense. You meet a man like Alexander, you connect, and if he chooses you, that means you've won. Simple. No history to carry, no emotional weight to sort through, just presence, attention, opportunity. And from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. Alexander, a man used to control, used to being understood without explaining himself. Jasmine, a woman who saw too much, felt too deeply, and no longer asked for reassurance. And Vanessa, stepping into a space that seemed open, unaware of what had already been built there before her. 3 people, 1 truth, but 3 completely different understandings of what that truth meant. Alexander thought he was making a decision. Jasmine knew the decision had already been made long before he spoke. And Vanessa? She believed she was the beginning of something, not realizing she had walked into the ending of something else. And that's where the tension lives, not in shouting, not in confrontation, but in perspective. Because while one person is explaining, another is observing, and someone else is assuming. And the most dangerous part, only one of them actually understands what's happening. Jasmine isn't trying to hold on. She isn't trying to compete. She isn't even trying to confront. She's watching, calculating, waiting, not for answers, but for confirmation. And Alexander? He doesn't see that yet. He's standing in front of her, thinking he still controls how this unfolds, thinking this moment is his, thinking he's the one shifting the direction of their story. But he's not anymore, because the moment Jasmine smiled, everything changed. He just hasn't caught up to it yet. But here's the part no one sees coming. Alexander thought that moment, the confession, was the turning point. He believed that was where everything shifted, where Jasmine would react, where emotions would take over, where he would finally see what this meant to her. But what he didn't understand was that Jasmine had already moved past that moment before it even arrived. She wasn't sitting there trying to process his words. She wasn't searching for meaning. She wasn't deciding what to do next. That part was already done, quietly, privately, without an announcement. Because while he was figuring out how to say it, Jasmine had been watching, not just his actions, but his patterns, his timing, his distance, the way his presence changed before his words ever did. And somewhere along the way, she stopped waiting for him to explain. She stopped needing confirmation. She already had it. So when he finally said, "There's someone else," it didn't break her. It aligned everything she had already felt. And that smile, that wasn't confusion. That wasn't denial. And it definitely wasn't weakness. That was awareness. That was control. That was a woman who understood something most people learn too late. When you see things clearly, you don't react, you decide. And what Alexander didn't know, what Vanessa didn't know, what nobody in that moment could see, was that Jasmine wasn't standing in the middle of losing something. She was standing at the beginning of changing everything. Before we go any further, take a second with me. If you've ever trusted your instincts before the truth showed up, if you've ever stayed calm when everything in you had a reason not to, or if you simply understand that sometimes silence says more than any argument ever could, go ahead and hit that like button. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, would you have reacted differently if you were sitting where Jasmine was? And if you're already feeling the weight of this story, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, because here we don't just tell stories for entertainment. We tell the kind that stay with you, the kind that make you think long after the screen goes dark. This one? It's only just beginning. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons. It's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. Washington, D.C. had a rhythm that most people didn't notice unless they grew up inside it. Not the version people saw on postcards or during political seasons. The real one, where mornings started early, not because people wanted them to, but because they had to. Where conversations carried through open windows, and someone always knew your name before you introduced yourself. That was the version Jasmine knew. Southeast D.C. wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished, but it was alive in a way that didn't need approval. On weekends, the streets felt warmer. Music drifted from one block to another like it didn't belong to just one house. Kids ran between parked cars, laughter echoing without anyone telling them to be quiet. Someone was always cooking something, whether there was a reason or not. And in the middle of all that, Jasmine grew up watching everything, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention. She noticed things, the way people spoke when they meant what they said, and when they didn't. The difference between someone showing up because they cared and someone showing up because they felt obligated. She learned early that words didn't always tell the full story. Her mother made sure of that. "Life will test you," her mother used to say, usually while standing in the kitchen, hands busy but voice steady. "But don't let it change how you see yourself." Jasmine didn't respond much when she heard it. She didn't need to, because she understood it. Not as advice, but as something she would carry, and she did. As she got older, that understanding shaped everything about her. She didn't chase attention, didn't need to be the loudest in the room, but when she spoke, people listened. Not because she forced it, but because there was something measured about the way she carried herself. Calm, intentional, present. By the time she reached her late 20s, Jasmine had built a life that made sense to her. Not perfect, but steady. She worked at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, the kind of place that didn't make headlines but kept things moving behind the scenes. Campaigns, branding strategies, client meetings, nothing flashy, but it required focus. And Jasmine was good at it. She didn't rush her work, didn't cut corners. She paid attention to details most people overlooked. And over time, that made her reliable. People trusted her, not loudly, but consistently. Her coworkers knew if Jasmine handled something, it would get done right. And outside of work, her life stayed simple. She kept her circle small. People she had known for years. People who didn't need explanations. People who understood her without needing everything spelled out. There was comfort in that, no pressure to be anything other than herself. And that mattered more to her than anything money could provide, because Jasmine wasn't chasing luxury. She wasn't looking for status. She was building something quieter. Peace, the kind that doesn't depend on where you are, but who you are when everything else gets quiet. And for a long time, she had it. There were no complications. No emotional confusion, no situations that made her question her instincts, just a life that moved forward at its own pace, balanced, grounded, clear, and maybe that's why, when something new finally entered her life, it didn't feel like a disruption at first. It felt like an addition, something that fit into the rhythm she had already built, something that didn't ask her to change. At least, that's how it seemed in the beginning. The first time Jasmine saw Alexander, he wasn't trying to be noticed, and that alone made him stand out. The event was one of those corporate networking gatherings downtown, polished, structured, filled with people who spoke in careful tones and measured sentences. Conversations overlapped in low hums, glasses clinked lightly, and everywhere you looked, someone was trying to make the right impression. Jasmine wasn't. She stood near the edge of the room, not hiding, just observing. A drink in her hand she hadn't touched much, her attention moving from one interaction to another. It wasn't judgment, it was habit. That's when she noticed him, not in the center of the room, not surrounded, just off to the side, listening. Most people at events like this talk too much, tried too hard to fill every silence. But Alexander didn't. He let people speak, let them finish. And when he responded, it was brief, but direct enough to hold weight. Jasmine watched him a little longer than she planned to, not because of how he looked, though that part was hard to ignore, but because of how still he seemed in a room full of movement. He didn't shift for attention. He didn't adjust himself to match the energy around him. He just existed in it, and for some reason, that caught her interest. She turned her attention away after a moment, shaking her head slightly at herself. "You're reading too much into it," she thought, but not even a minute later. "Do you always observe the room like that?" The voice came from beside her, calm, low, unrushed. Jasmine didn't turn immediately. Instead, she took a small breath, then glanced over. It was him. Closer now, the details became clearer. His posture, relaxed but intentional. His expression, neutral but not distant. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Do you always walk up to people and call them out?" She replied. There was a brief pause, not awkward, measured, then just the smallest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not a full smile, but enough. "Only when they're doing it well," he said. Jasmine let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It depends, he answered. Do you take it as one? She studied him for a second, not his words, him, the way he didn't rush to fill the silence after speaking, the way he held eye contact without forcing it. Grounded, that was the word. Maybe, she said finally. I'll decide later. That earned a slightly more visible smile. I'm Alexander. Jasmine. Another pause. But this one felt different, less like strangers meeting, more like something settling into place. He glanced briefly around the room, then back at her. You don't seem impressed by any of this, he said. Jasmine followed his gaze for a second. The conversations, the postures, the subtle competition in the air, then shrugged lightly. It's not about being impressed, she replied. It's just predictable. Alexander tilted his head slightly. Predictable how? Everyone's trying to be remembered, she said, but they're all doing it the same way. And you're not? He asked. She shook her head once. I don't need to be remembered by everyone. That landed. He didn't respond right away, and for the first time, it felt like she had shifted something in him. Not dramatically, just enough. You're different, he said, more to himself than to her. Jasmine caught it anyway. Different, how? Another pause. But this time, it wasn't calculated. It was honest. You're not trying to get anything from this room, he said. She held his gaze. Maybe I already have everything I need. That stayed between them. No interruption, no distraction, just a quiet understanding that neither of them rushed to define. Someone called Alexander's name from across the room. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, he looked at Jasmine for a second longer, like he was deciding something. I should go, he said. Probably, she replied, but neither of them moved right away. Then finally, he stepped back slightly. It was good meeting you. Jasmine nodded. Yeah, it was. He walked away without looking back immediately, but a few steps in, he paused, just briefly, then continued. Jasmine noticed. Of course she did. And as she stood there, watching the room return to its usual rhythm, she realized something she hadn't expected. That interaction, it hadn't felt like networking. It hadn't felt forced. It hadn't even felt new in the way most introductions did. It felt intentional, like something that wasn't trying to happen, but did anyway. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine didn't overanalyze it. She just let it be. After that night, nothing about Jasmine's life rushed forward. It shifted, but quietly. Alexander didn't flutter with messages the next morning. No sudden intensity, no forced momentum, just consistency. A message later the next day. There's a place near the waterfront. You'd probably like it. No pressure. Jasmine read it once, then again. Simple. No performance behind it. She replied, hours later, maybe. And that was how it started. Not with grand gestures, not with urgency. Just two people choosing to continue something that felt easy. Their first dinner wasn't extravagant. No private rooms. No unnecessary attention. Just a quiet restaurant where conversations didn't have to compete with noise. Alexander arrived first. Of course he did. Jasmine noticed the moment she walked in, not because he stood out loudly, but because he didn't look around to be noticed. He was already settled, already present. He stood when he saw her. Not rushed, not overly formal, just enough. You came, he said. Jasmine pulled out her chair, sitting across from him. I said maybe. That slight smile again. I took the risk. She glanced at the menu briefly, then back at him. You always take risks like that, only when they make sense. And this made sense? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying her the same way he had the first night. Yes, that was it. No explanation. And strangely, it didn't feel incomplete. Their conversations stretched, past the point of small talk, past the expected questions. They didn't try to impress each other. They tried to understand. Alexander spoke less than most men Jasmine had met, but when he did, there was intention behind it. He didn't say things just to fill space. And Jasmine noticed something else. He listened. Not the kind of listening where someone waits for their turn to speak. Real listening. He remembered things. The way she paused before answering certain questions. The way she preferred her coffee. no extra sweetness, the way she didn't rush her thoughts. And over time, Jasmine found herself doing something she didn't usually do. She relaxed, not all at once, but gradually. Weeks turned into months. Dinners became routine. Walks through the city replaced crowded spaces. There were nights where they didn't plan anything at all, just found themselves talking longer than expected, time moving without either of them checking it. It wasn't intense. It wasn't overwhelming. It was steady, and that's what made it real. There was one night that stayed with her, not because of anything dramatic, but because of how simple it was. They were sitting on the balcony of Alexander's penthouse, the city spread out below them, lights stretching into the distance, the kind of view people usually tried to capture in photos. But somehow, it felt better just being there. Jasmine leaned slightly against the railing, her arms resting comfortably. "You're quieter tonight," she said. Alexander sat across from her, a glass in his hand he hadn't touched in a while. "I'm thinking," he replied. "About?" He looked out at the city for a moment before answering. "You." Jasmine turned her head slightly, studying him. "That sounds serious." "It's not," he said. Then, after a pause, "Or maybe it is." She let out a soft breath. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Answer without answering." That earned a small, genuine smile. "I'm trying to figure something out," he said. "And you need me for that?" She asked lightly. "I think I do." That shifted something. Not dramatically, just enough. Jasmine straightened slightly, her attention fully on him now. "What are you trying to figure out?" Alexander met her gaze, and for once, there was no distance in it, no calculation, just honesty. "How you make things feel less complicated." Jasmine blinked once, caught slightly off guard. "I don't do anything," she said. "You do," he replied. "You just don't try to." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't empty. It held something unspoken, but understood. Jasmine looked away briefly, back toward the city. "You're different around me," she said after a moment. Alexander didn't deny it. "Is that a problem?" She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It just means I'm seeing a version of you. Other people don't." He leaned back slightly, his expression softening. "Maybe you're the only one who's supposed to." That stayed with her, long after the conversation moved on. That was the night Jasmine let her guard down. Not completely, but enough to allow something real to exist. The proposal didn't come with attention, no audience, no elaborate setup, just another quiet evening, the same balcony, the same city stretched out beneath them. Alexander stood beside her this time, closer than usual, and when he spoke, his voice didn't carry weight because it was loud. It carried weight because it was certain. "I don't want to overthink this," he said. Jasmine turned toward him slightly. "Then don't." He held her gaze. "I want to build something with you," he said. "Not complicated, not forced, just real." She didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't know her answer, but because she felt the moment fully before stepping into it. "Are you asking me something?" she said softly. A small pause. Then, "Yes." Simple, direct, no performance. Jasmine looked at him for a long second, and then she nodded. "Okay." No dramatic reaction, no hesitation, just a decision that felt aligned with everything they had built. And for that moment, it made sense. Marriage didn't arrive with noise. It didn't change everything overnight. If anything, it felt like a continuation of what was already working. Jasmine didn't wake up the next day feeling different. She didn't suddenly see the world through a new lens. Life simply expanded. The penthouse became home, not immediately in the emotional sense, but in the practical one. Her things moved in first. Clothes arranged carefully into spaces that had previously been untouched. Shoes lined up in a way that made sense to her, not just visually, but functionally. Small details began to shift the atmosphere. Alexander noticed, not out loud, but in the way he paused slightly when walking into certain rooms, like he was adjusting to a presence that now belonged there. Jasmine didn't try to redesign anything. She didn't feel the need to prove she fit into the space. She just existed in it. And slowly, the place adapted. The mornings were quiet. Alexander usually up early, moving through his routine with precision. Calls scheduled, messages answered, Everything structured before most people started their day. Jasmine's pace was different, not slower, just less rigid. She still worked downtown, still maintained her responsibilities, still handled her role with the same level of focus. Nothing about her work changed, and that was intentional, because while everything around her had elevated in appearance, she hadn't, not in the ways that mattered. But the world around Alexander, that was different, completely. Events became more frequent. Private dinners, business gatherings, spaces where conversations were controlled, and every interaction carried a purpose. Jasmine attended some of them, not all. And the first time she stepped into one as his wife, she felt it. Not discomfort, not insecurity, just awareness. The way conversations paused for half a second longer when she entered. The way eyes moved, not rudely, not directly, but carefully, assessing, placing her, trying to understand where she fit within a world that already had its structure. Jasmine didn't shrink. She never had. Instead, she moved through those spaces the same way she always moved. Present, observing, unapologetically herself. At one event, a woman approached her with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're Jasmine, right?" she said. Jasmine nodded once. "I've heard about you." There was something in the tone, not disrespect, but not warmth either. Jasmine met her gaze evenly. "I hope it was accurate." A slight pause. The woman smiled again, this time a little tighter. Alexander doesn't usually bring people into his world like this. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "Then I guess this is new for everyone." That ended the conversation, not abruptly, but clearly. Later that evening, as they stood near the edge of the room, Alexander glanced at her briefly. "You handled that well," he said. Jasmine didn't look at him immediately. "I wasn't handling anything." He studied her for a second. "You don't feel out of place here?" That made her turn. Not defensive, just direct. "No," she said. "Do you?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence said more than anything else. That was the difference between them. Alexander belonged to that world. It was built into his routine, his expectations, the way people interacted with him. Jasmine didn't belong to it, and she didn't try to. She moved through it without adjusting herself to match it. And for a while, that balance worked. He respected her for it, maybe even admired it, because around her, things didn't feel rehearsed. They felt real. At home, things stayed simple, even in a space that was anything but. Conversations weren't forced. Silences weren't uncomfortable. They didn't need constant interaction to feel connected. And for a time, that was enough, more than enough, because nothing felt missing, nothing felt off, nothing felt like it needed to be questioned. Everything had its place. Everything made sense. And maybe that's why, when things began to shift later, it didn't happen loudly. It didn't come with warning. It started in places most people wouldn't notice. But Jasmine would, because she always did. At first, nothing felt different, not in a way that could be pointed out. No single moment Jasmine could stop and say, "This is where it changed." Everything still moved the way it always had. Mornings were quiet. Evenings were shared. Conversations happened without effort. Life continued in a rhythm that didn't demand attention. But over time, that rhythm started to shift. Not loudly, just enough. It began with small things, the kind people usually ignore. Alexander had always been present, even when he was busy. There was a difference between being occupied and being distant, and Jasmine had always understood that difference without needing to explain it. Now, there were moments where he was physically there, but not fully engaged. She noticed it one evening. They were sitting in the living room, both unwinding after a long day. The television played softly in the background, neither of them really watching it. Jasmine said something, simple, not important, a small observation about her day. Alexander nodded, but his response came a second too late. And when he spoke, it didn't quite connect to what she had said. Jasmine didn't react. She just noticed. The phone came next, not suddenly, gradually. Alexander had never been secretive before. His phone was just a tool, something he used when needed, then set aside without thought. Now, it stayed closer, always within reach, sometimes face down, sometimes picked up quickly after a notification, then set back down just as fast. Not enough to raise suspicion on its own, but enough to create a pattern. And Jasmine, she paid attention to patterns. One night, he stood near the window, his back slightly turned as he spoke on the phone. His voice was lower than usual, not business, not the tone he used when discussing work. Jasmine didn't move toward him. She didn't need to hear every word. She heard enough. A quiet pause, then a softer response, followed by a brief silence that didn't feel professional. When he ended the call and turned back, Jasmine was exactly where she had been, calm, unchanged. "You're up late," he said. "So are you," she replied. Another pause. Neither of them filled it. The timing started to shift after that. Meetings ran longer. Dinners were pushed back. Some nights he came home just late enough to make it seem reasonable, but not late enough to invite questions. And Jasmine didn't ask, not because she didn't notice, but because she was watching. There was a difference now, not in what he said, but in how he said it. His tone remained controlled, but there were moments, brief ones, where it felt slightly distant, like his attention was divided between the conversation in front of him and something else just out of reach. Jasmine tested nothing. She didn't push, didn't challenge. Instead, she adjusted in a quieter way. She listened more closely, observed more carefully, and slowly, she stopped filling in the gaps for him. At dinner one evening, they sat across from each other like they always had. The setting hadn't changed. The routine hadn't changed. But something about the space between them felt different. Not empty, just less connected. Alexander glanced at his phone briefly before placing it beside his plate. Jasmine saw it. Of course she did. But she didn't comment. Instead, she continued eating, her movements steady, her expression neutral. "How was your day?" he asked. "It was fine," she replied, short, not dismissive, "just complete." He nodded, but he didn't ask anything else, and she didn't offer more. That was new, not the silence. They had always been comfortable with silence, but this kind of silence felt different. It didn't carry ease. It carried distance, subtle but present. Jasmine didn't label it. She didn't rush to define what she was seeing, because she understood something most people didn't take the time to recognize. When something changes, it rarely announces itself all at once. It reveals itself in fragments, moments that don't quite match what came before, patterns that form slowly enough to be overlooked by anyone who isn't paying attention. But Jasmine was, always, and as the days passed, those fragments began to connect, not into a conclusion, not yet, but into something clear enough to acknowledge internally. Something was different, not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently, and consistency meant something. Still, she didn't confront him, didn't ask questions, didn't search for explanations, because she wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't trying to catch anything. She was allowing things to reveal themselves, naturally, without pressure, without interruption. And Alexander, he didn't notice the shift in her, not immediately, because on the surface, nothing had changed. Jasmine still showed up the same way, still spoke the same way, still moved through their life without disruption. But beneath that, something had adjusted, quietly, carefully, and once that adjustment happened, there was no going back to how things were before. By the time the distance became noticeable, it still didn't look like a problem. There were no arguments, no tension strong enough to name, no moment that demanded attention. But something had changed in the way their time felt. Not what they did, not where they went, just how it existed between them. Jasmine didn't rush to fix it. She didn't even approach it like something that needed fixing. She approached it like something that needed to be understood. And understanding for her didn't come from asking too early. It came from observing long enough. One evening, the city was quieter than usual. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, soft enough to fade into the background, but steady enough to be noticed. Jasmine sat on the couch, her legs tucked slightly beneath her, a book resting open in her hands. She hadn't turned the page in a while. Across the room, Alexander stood near the counter, scrolling through his phone. Not urgently, not carelessly, just occupied. The space between them wasn't large, but it felt different. Not heavy, Just disconnected. Jasmine closed the book gently. The sound was soft, but it shifted the moment. Alexander glanced up briefly. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. That was the thing. She wasn't upset. She wasn't hurt in the way people expect. She was aware. She studied him for a second, not searching, just observing. Then she asked, "Are you happy?" The question didn't come with emotion. No weight added to it. No hidden tone. Just direct. Alexander paused, not dramatically, but long enough for it to register. "That's a random question," he said, setting his phone down slowly. Jasmine shook her head slightly. "Not really." He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms loosely. "Why are you asking?" Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She held his gaze, calm, steady. "Because I'm curious," she said. Another pause. This one stretched just a little longer. Alexander nodded once, like he had reached a conclusion. "Of course I am," he replied. The answer was clean, simple, exactly what someone would expect to hear. Jasmine nodded, not slowly, not thoughtfully, just once. "Good," she said, and reached for her book again. That was it. No follow-up, no deeper conversation, no attempt to unpack the moment. And somehow, that made it linger. Alexander didn't return to his phone right away. He stayed where he was, watching her for a second longer than usual, because something about that exchange didn't feel finished. It felt placed, like a statement disguised as a question. "What about you?" he asked. Jasmine looked up again, her expression unchanged. "What about me?" "Are you happy?" he said. She held his gaze for a moment, not avoiding it, not softening it, just meeting it. "Yes," she replied, and unlike his answer, hers didn't feel rehearsed. It didn't feel placed. It just existed. Another pause, but this one carried something different. Not tension, not conflict, just awareness. Alexander nodded slightly, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, not doubt, not confusion, something closer to uncertainty, like he wasn't sure what had just passed between them, but he knew it mattered. Jasmine returned her attention to the book. This time, she turned the page, but she wasn't reading, not really. Her mind wasn't on the words. It was on what had just happened. That question hadn't come from emotion. It hadn't come from fear. It came from observation, from noticing the distance without needing to name it out loud, from recognizing that something had shifted, and choosing to acknowledge it without forcing a reaction. And in that moment, something in Jasmine adjusted, not outwardly. Nothing about her behavior changed. She didn't pull away. She didn't become colder. She didn't act differently. But internally, she stopped expecting things to return to what they had been. That was the shift. Not dramatic, not visible, but real. Because once you start asking questions like that, you're no longer standing in the same place you were before. You're not reacting, you're evaluating. And once that begins, everything starts to look clearer. Alexander didn't understand it. Not fully, not yet, but he felt it. In the way the room settled afterward. In the way Jasmine didn't press further. In the way she seemed unchanged. But she wasn't. Not anymore. If you've ever noticed something was off before anyone admitted it, comment. I felt it too. And if you're starting to see where this is going, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Gray Family. Because this story, we're only just getting deeper into it. It happened on a Thursday. Not the kind of day people remember. No special occasion. No reason for anything to stand out. Just another day that moved the way most days do. Quietly, without asking to be noticed. Jasmine got home earlier than usual. Her schedule had opened up unexpectedly. A meeting pushed back, giving her time she didn't plan for. She didn't announce it, didn't text ahead. She just went home. The elevator ride was quiet, the soft hum filling the space as numbers lit up one by one. When the doors opened, everything felt still, not unusual, just quieter than expected for that time of evening. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Her heels came off near the entrance, placed neatly where they always went. Her bag followed, set down without thought. For a moment, she stood there, listening. That's when she heard it. Alexander's voice, low, not raised, not sharp, just different. Jasmine didn't move immediately. She didn't rush toward the sound. Instead, she walked forward at her normal pace, her steps quiet against the floor. The closer she got, the clearer it became. He was on the phone, but not in the way he usually was. There was a softness in his tone, a pause between his words that didn't belong to business. And then, a quiet laugh, short, unforced, the kind she hadn't heard from him in a while. Jasmine stopped just before turning the corner, not hiding, not avoiding, just pausing. "I'll see you soon." The words came clearly this time, followed by silence. Then the subtle sound of the call ending. Jasmine stood there for a second longer, not frozen, not overwhelmed, just still. There was no rush of emotion, no immediate conclusion forming, just a quiet shift inside her, something aligning. When she stepped into the living room, Alexander had already moved away from where he stood. He turned when he saw her. There it was, that brief flicker, surprise, small but noticeable. "Didn't know you were home," he said. His voice had returned to normal, controlled, even. Jasmine walked in fully, her expression unchanged. "Got done early," she replied. Simple, nothing added. There was a pause, not long, but present. Alexander nodded once. "Everything okay?" he asked. Jasmine met his gaze. For a second, just long enough. "Yes," she said. She moved past him, settling into her usual space as if nothing had shifted. Her phone came out, her posture relaxed, her movements steady. Everything about her looked familiar. But internally, something had connected. Not the full picture, not yet, but enough pieces had aligned to form something clear. The tone of his voice, the timing, the way he had ended the call, the way he looked at her when she walked in. None of it, on its own, meant anything definitive. But together, it formed a pattern, and Jasmine had always understood patterns. She didn't question him, didn't ask who he was speaking to, didn't push the moment further than it needed to go. Instead, she leaned back slightly, scrolling through her phone, her expression calm. Alexander watched her for a second, like he was expecting something, a question, a reaction, anything, but it didn't come. "What are you up to tonight?" he asked. The question felt casual, but there was something beneath it. Jasmine didn't look up immediately. "Nothing planned," she said. "I might be out a little later," he added. That was new, not the statement, but the way it was placed. Jasmine nodded once. "Okay." No hesitation, no follow-up, no shift in tone. And that was the moment, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't, because for the first time, Jasmine wasn't trying to understand what was happening in real time. She had already started understanding it, not emotionally, not reactively, but clearly, and that clarity didn't arrive with noise. It settled in quietly, like something she had been expecting, finally stepping into place. Vanessa had never been the kind of woman who waited for things to happen. She believed in positioning, not loudly, not in ways that made people uncomfortable, but in ways that ensured she was always exactly where opportunities could find her. Her life had been structured that way from the beginning, everything intentional, everything placed. She grew up in environments where expectations were clear, even when they weren't spoken directly. Private schools, carefully selected social circles, spaces where people understood early that connections mattered just as much as capability. Vanessa learned quickly, not just how to exist in those spaces, but how to move within them. She understood timing, when to speak, when to listen, when to let a moment pass without forcing it. And more importantly, she understood presence. Vanessa didn't compete for attention. She made herself noticeable without reaching for it. A look held just long enough, a response given with just enough detail, a pause that invited curiosity instead of filling silence too quickly. It wasn't manipulation, not in the way people usually think. It was awareness, and she used it well. By the time she reached her late 20s, Vanessa had built a life that aligned with the environment she moved in. She didn't struggle to enter rooms. She belonged in them. People recognized her, not because she demanded it, but because she understood how to maintain it. And that's how she saw Alexander, not as a stranger, not as someone out of reach, but as someone who existed within the same level of access she was already part of. The event where they met wasn't open. It wasn't the kind of place where introductions happened randomly. Everyone there already held a certain level of relevance, and Vanessa noticed him almost immediately, not because of how he looked, though that part didn't go unnoticed, but because of how people adjusted around him. There was space where he stood, not physical space, but social space, the kind that forms naturally around someone who carries influence without needing to announce it. Vanessa didn't approach him right away. She didn't rush. She observed first, watched how he interacted, who he responded to, what he ignored, and then, at the right moment, she placed herself within his line of interaction. It wasn't forced. It didn't feel intentional from the outside, but it was. Their first conversation didn't carry weight at first, just a natural exchange. Brief, measured. "You don't seem particularly interested in any of this," Vanessa said, glancing lightly around the room. Alexander looked at her, then followed her gaze for a second. "I could say the same about you," he replied. She smiled slightly. "Maybe I'm just selective. That makes two of us." The conversation didn't stretch. It didn't need to, because the point wasn't to say everything. It was to leave something, and Vanessa knew that, over time, their paths crossed again. Not accidentally, but not in a way that felt planned either. Short conversations turned into longer ones, not deep, not personal, but easy. That was the difference. Vanessa didn't ask questions that required reflection. She didn't challenge his perspective. She didn't slow him down. She moved with him, matched his pace, aligned with his environment. And for someone like Alexander, that mattered, because his world already required constant awareness, constant decisions, constant adjustments. Vanessa didn't add to that. She removed it. There were no pauses where he had to explain himself, no moments where he felt examined, no conversations that asked him to look deeper than he wanted to. With her, everything felt smooth, and that smoothness created space. Not emotional space, but mental space, the kind that doesn't demand anything. And slowly, that became familiar. Vanessa didn't think of it as taking something from someone else. That wasn't how she saw things. In her mind, if someone chose her, that meant something. It meant she had been seen, selected, prioritized, and from where she stood, that's exactly what this looked like. She didn't see the history behind it, didn't feel the depth that existed before her. She saw the present, the attention, the time, the consistency that was beginning to shift in her direction, and in her world. That was enough. Because Vanessa didn't measure things by what used to be, she measured them by what was happening now. And right now, she believed she was stepping into something that was opening for her, not realizing. She had entered at a point where something else had already started closing, and the difference between those two things was something she hadn't learned to recognize yet. What developed between Alexander and Vanessa didn't feel dramatic. It didn't arrive with intensity or urgency. It settled in quietly, through repetition. At first, their interactions stayed within familiar spaces, events, short conversations, moments that didn't require explanation. But over time, those moments extended, a conversation that lasted a little longer than expected, a message sent outside of the usual context, a second meeting that didn't need to happen, but did. Nothing about it felt disruptive. That was the part that made it easy to continue. Vanessa didn't ask where he had been before. She didn't ask what he was leaving behind. She didn't need details, and Alexander didn't offer them. With her, conversations didn't require him to think too far ahead. They stayed present, focused on what was happening in that moment. "You're always this quiet?" Vanessa asked once, leaning slightly back in her chair. Alexander glanced at her briefly. "Only when I don't have anything to add." She smiled. "Or when you're deciding what's worth saying." He didn't deny it. That was how it worked between them. Light exchanges, no pressure to go deeper than necessary. And for Alexander, that felt different, because his life, outside of those moments, was structured. Everything carried weight. Every decision led somewhere. Vanessa didn't carry that weight. She didn't add to it. If anything, she made things feel simpler, not better, not more meaningful. just easier to move through. And slowly, that difference began to matter. It wasn't something Alexander sat down and thought through. It wasn't a decision made in a single moment. It was a gradual shift. He found himself staying a little longer, responding a little quicker, choosing conversations that required less from him. And without realizing it, he started dividing his attention. Back at home, things didn't break. They didn't fall apart. Jasmine was still there, still present, still moving through her days with the same quiet awareness she had always carried. But the difference now was what she noticed. It wasn't just patterns anymore. It was consistency within those patterns. Alexander's schedule had always been full. That hadn't changed. But now, there were moments that didn't align, gaps that didn't quite connect to the explanations given. Not obvious, not enough to question directly, but enough to be recognized. Jasmine didn't follow him, didn't check his phone, didn't search for confirmation. She didn't need to, because what she was observing wasn't random. It was structured, and structure meant intention. One evening, he returned home later than usual, not late enough to stand out to anyone else, but late enough for her to notice. "You're back," she said, her tone even. Alexander nodded, setting his keys down. "Long day." Jasmine looked at him briefly, not questioning, just registering. "Sounds like it," she replied. He moved through the room like he always did. No hesitation, no visible shift. But there was something missing, not in what he said, but in how present he felt while saying it. And Jasmine recognized that difference immediately. Later that night, as they sat in the same space but occupied by different thoughts, the distance between them felt more defined, not because it had grown suddenly, but because it had settled into something consistent. Alexander glanced at her once, like he was about to say something, but he didn't, and Jasmine didn't fill that silence, because she had reached a point where she no longer needed to. The understanding was already forming, not in complete detail, not fully confirmed, but clear enough to know this wasn't temporary, this wasn't a passing shift, this was movement, and not in her direction. Still, she remained exactly where she was, not holding on, not pulling away, just present, watching, because she understood something that most people only realize too late. When something is changing, forcing it to reveal itself too early only delays the truth, but letting it unfold without interference always leads to clarity. And Jasmine was getting closer to that clarity with every passing day. Alexander just didn't realize. He was the one revealing it. The night didn't feel different when it started. Nothing in the air suggested that anything was about to change. Alexander stood near the window, his back partially turned, the city stretched out in front of him like it always was, steady, distant, unaffected. Jasmine sat on the couch, not doing anything unusual, just present. There had been fewer conversations that day, not intentional, just less to say. Alexander didn't turn immediately. His hands rested in his pockets, his posture composed, but there was a pause in him that hadn't been there before. "I think we need to talk." Jasmine looked up, not quickly, not slowly, just naturally. "Okay." She didn't ask what about, didn't shift her position, didn't prepare herself outwardly. Alexander turned then, fully, facing her. For a brief moment, he said nothing, not because he didn't know what to say, but because saying it now felt different than it had in his head. Jasmine waited, not with anticipation, not with concern, just waiting. "There's someone else." The words landed in the room, simple, direct, without decoration. Alexander held her gaze, watching, expecting. Jasmine didn't move, not immediately. There was no visible reaction, no tension rising in her shoulders, no sharp inhale, no shift in posture. She let the words exist, and in that space, something settled. Not confusion, not disbelief, understanding. She had already reached it. This moment didn't take her there. It confirmed it. A few seconds passed. Quiet. Then, Jasmine smiled. Not wide, not forced, not emotional. Controlled. The kind of smile that didn't belong to the moment he had just created. Alexander frowned slightly. Not anger, something closer to uncertainty. "Did you hear what I said?" he asked. Jasmine nodded once. "I did." Her voice stayed even, no strain, no edge. And that's when the shift began, because this wasn't how this was supposed to go. Alexander had expected something else, not necessarily a scene, but something, a question, a reaction, a moment he could respond to. But Jasmine didn't give him anything to work with. She leaned back slightly, her eyes still on him, studying him in a way that felt different, not like a wife reacting, like someone observing a situation that had already made sense to them before it was explained. The silence stretched. Alexander took a step forward. "Say something," he said. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, just thoughtful. "What would you like me to say?" she asked. That wasn't deflection. It was direct. Alexander paused, because he didn't have an answer for that. "I just told you there's someone else," he said, his tone tightening slightly. "I know," Jasmine replied. Still no shift. Still no reaction that matched what he expected. And that unsettled him, because now the moment wasn't following his control. "You don't have anything else to say?" he asked. Jasmine held his gaze. Then that same small smile returned, slightly different this time. Colder, not emotional, not soft, certain. "I was wondering when you'd say it," she said. The words landed heavier than anything else in the room. Alexander stared at her. That wasn't the response he had prepared for. "What does that mean?" he asked. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She let the moment breathe. Then, "It means this didn't start today," she said. "No accusation, no raised voice, just truth." And that truth shifted everything, because now he wasn't the one revealing something. She was. And suddenly, the ground he thought he was standing on didn't feel as steady. "Why are you smiling?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Jasmine looked at him for a moment, really looked, then said, "Because you think this is where I lose." A pause. Her expression didn't change. "But you don't even realize." She continued softly, "This is where things start to change." Silence followed, not empty, heavy, because for the first time since the conversation started, Alexander wasn't in control of it anymore, and he could feel it. He just didn't understand how it had happened. The room didn't change, but the balance inside it did. Alexander stood where he was, but something in his posture shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but enough. He had walked into that moment, expecting to lead it, to say what needed to be said, to control how it unfolded after, but now, he wasn't sure where he stood in it anymore. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, hadn't challenged him, hadn't even moved much, and somehow, that made everything heavier. "I don't understand what you mean," Alexander said. His tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't as steady as before. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, studying him again, not as a reaction, as if she were confirming something. "You don't understand," she repeated. A small pause. Then she leaned forward just slightly, her hands resting together. "I was wondering how long it would take," she said. There it was, clear, uncomplicated. Alexander blinked once. That sentence didn't fit into anything he had prepared. "How long what would take?" he asked. Jasmine didn't rush her answer. "For you to say it out loud," she replied. Her voice remained even, no pressure, no accusation, and that made it harder to respond to. Alexander let out a quiet breath, running a hand along his jaw. "This isn't something I planned," he said. Jasmine nodded once. "I know." That response landed differently than expected. He looked at her, searching for something. "You don't seem surprised," he said. "I'm not," Jasmine answered. Another pause, because that answer didn't leave space for anything else. "How?" he asked. It wasn't defensive. It was genuine, because from where he stood, there had been no confrontation, no signs that she knew. Jasmine leaned back again, her posture relaxed. "You changed," she said, simple. Alexander frowned slightly. "I didn't." She didn't interrupt him loudly, but she did interrupt him. "You did," she said, not forcefully, just clearly, and that stopped him, because there was no emotion behind it, no exaggeration, just a statement. Jasmine held his gaze, not in a way that was obvious, she continued, not in a way anyone else would notice right away. She paused, but enough. Alexander looked away for a second, not because he didn't want to hear it, but because something about the way she was saying it made it harder to stay grounded. I didn't think, he started, that I would notice? Jasmine finished for him. He didn't answer, because that was exactly what he had thought. And now, that assumption was sitting in the open between them. Jasmine's expression didn't change. I don't need everything explained to understand what's happening, she said. Her tone remained calm, but there was something beneath it now. Not emotion, not anger, certainty. Alexander shifted his weight slightly. That was new, because now, he wasn't responding from control. He was reacting. I wasn't trying to hide anything, he said. Jasmine gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. I know, she replied. That response slowed him down again, because it removed the need to defend himself. And without that, he didn't know what position to take. You think this is simple? He asked. Jasmine looked at him, not confused, not defensive. No, she said. Another pause. Then, I think it's clear. That landed heavier than anything else, because clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just exists. Alexander exhaled slowly, running his hand through his hair. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave him. It never does, she replied. No sarcasm, no edge, just truth. And that truth made the space between them feel different, because now, he wasn't explaining something new. He was standing in something she had already understood, and that shifted everything. Alexander took a step closer. Why aren't you angry? He asked. That question carried more weight than anything he had said so far, because now, he wasn't trying to control the moment anymore. He was trying to understand it. Jasmine held his gaze, then said, because I'm not confused. Silence, not short, not passing, heavy, because confusion allows for emotion. It creates space for reaction, for questions, for uncertainty. But clarity ends that, and Alexander felt it, in the way she spoke, in the way she didn't raise her voice, in the way she didn't need anything from him in that moment. That was the shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete, because for the first time, he wasn't leading the situation anymore, and Jasmine wasn't following it. She was already ahead of it, and there was nothing he could say now that would bring it back to where it had been before. After that conversation, nothing exploded. There was no argument that followed, no raised voices, no doors closing harder than necessary, just space. Alexander didn't try to continue the conversation, not because there was nothing left to say, but because he had reached a point where he didn't know what to say next. Jasmine didn't fill that silence. She stood up slowly, her movements steady, and walked past him, not brushing against him, not pausing for effect, just moving. Thank you for being honest, she said. Her voice wasn't heavy. It wasn't fragile. It was settled. Alexander turned slightly as she passed, watching her in a way he hadn't before, because something about that response didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like conclusion. Jasmine stepped out onto the balcony. The night air met her gently, carrying the distant rhythm of the city below. Lights stretched across the horizon, familiar and unchanged. Cars moved. People continued. Somewhere, life carried on without interruption. She rested her hands lightly against the railing. For a moment, she didn't think. She just stood there, not trying to process, not trying to understand, because understanding had already happened. What remained now was clarity settling into place. She thought about the beginning, not every detail, just the feeling, the ease, the conversations that didn't require effort, the version of Alexander she had come to know. And then she thought about the shift, not as a single moment, but as a series of small changes that had built quietly over time. And as she stood there was no confusion about it anymore, no questions waiting to be asked, no answers she needed to hear, just truth. And with that truth came something unexpected, peace, not immediate, not overwhelming, but present, because she wasn't standing there wondering what she could have done differently. She wasn't replaying moments. She wasn't holding on to something that had already moved away from her. She was standing in the reality of what was, without needing it to be anything else. Behind her, the door opened. Alexander stepped onto the balcony. He didn't come too close, didn't interrupt the space she had created. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he said. Jasmine didn't turn immediately. "I know," she replied, and she did. That was the difference. This wasn't about blaming him. It wasn't about turning him into something he wasn't. It was about seeing clearly what had already taken place. He stepped a little closer. "Why aren't you angry?" he asked again. Jasmine turned this time, not sharply, just enough to face him. "Because I'm not trying to hold on to something that's already gone," she said. Her tone remained steady. "That's where anger comes from," she added, "when you're still reaching for something that isn't there anymore." Alexander looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, there was no response ready, because what she was saying didn't invite argument, it closed it. Jasmine held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, she gave a small nod, not to him, to the moment, and turned back toward the city. That was it. No final speech, no drawn-out goodbye, just a quiet ending that didn't need to be announced, because for Jasmine, it had already ended. Not when he spoke, not when she smiled, but earlier, in the moments where things stopped aligning. And now, she wasn't leaving emotionally. She had already left. This was just the moment it became visible. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes as she stood there, not broken, not lost, just certain, and in that certainty, there was strength, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. If you've ever chosen peace over drama, like this video right now, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. The next morning didn't carry tension. There was no lingering weight from the night before, no atmosphere that suggested something had ended. If anything, it felt normal. Jasmine woke up at her usual time. No hesitation, no delay. She moved through the penthouse the same way she always had. Quiet, intentional, coffee brewed, the soft sound filling the kitchen as sunlight began to stretch across the floor. Alexander was already awake, standing near the counter, his posture familiar, but something about him was slightly off. He looked at her when she entered, like he was expecting something different, a change, a reaction, a shift in behavior, but Jasmine didn't give him any of that. "Morning," she said, simple. Alexander nodded. "Morning." A pause. He waited. She didn't fill it. Instead, she poured her coffee, her movements steady, her focus on what she was doing, not on what had already been decided. That was the difference. For Alexander, the conversation from the night before was still present, unresolved. For Jasmine, it had already moved forward. "About last night," he started. Jasmine didn't interrupt him, but she didn't engage either. "You don't need to explain anything," she said. Not dismissive, not cold, just final. Alexander frowned slightly. "That's not what I was." "It's okay," she added, meeting his gaze briefly. And that ended it, because there was nothing left to clarify. She picked up her cup and moved past him, not avoiding, not rushing, just continuing. The changes didn't happen all at once. Jasmine didn't pack everything immediately, didn't make dramatic decisions in a single moment. She moved with precision. That was the only way to describe it. Small adjustments. Her schedule shifted first, spending less time at home, not as a reaction, but as a natural extension of what had already changed. Then came her space. Closet sections that had once been shared began to separate, not visibly at first, but intentionally. Items she no longer needed there were no longer there. Alexander noticed. Of course he did. But nothing about it felt abrupt enough to question directly. That was what unsettled him, because there was no clear moment where he could step in and say, "Wait." Everything was happening without confrontation, without discussion, without resistance, and that left him without control. One evening, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching as Jasmine folded clothes neatly into a suitcase. Not hurried, not emotional, just methodical. "You're leaving?" he asked. Jasmine didn't stop. "I'm adjusting," she replied. He stepped further into the room. "That's not what this looks like." She zipped the suitcase calmly. "What does it look like?" she asked. There was no challenge in her voice, Just a question, and Alexander didn't answer immediately, because what it looked like was something he hadn't expected. It didn't look like loss, it looked like decision. I thought we would at least talk about this, he said. Jasmine stood, turning to face him. We already did, she replied. That landed, not because it was loud, but because it was true, and truth didn't need repetition. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room before stopping again. This isn't how things usually go, he said. Jasmine gave a small nod. I know, she replied. Another pause. Then, that's why it's working. That shifted something again, because now he couldn't predict what came next. Jasmine picked up the suitcase, moving past him without hesitation, not brushing against him, not slowing down, just continuing forward, and for the first time, Alexander felt it clearly. Not the loss of the relationship, but the loss of control over how it ended, because he hadn't decided this part, he had only started it. Jasmine was the one finishing it, and she was doing it in a way he couldn't interrupt. That was what stayed with him. Not anger, not regret, just the realization that this wasn't unfolding on his terms anymore, and there was nothing he could do to change that. At first, everything looked like it had worked out. Alexander was there, not occasionally, not in passing, consistently. Vanessa didn't have to wonder if he would call. She didn't have to question if he would show up. He did, and from the outside, that was exactly what it was supposed to look like. Dinners became more regular, not the kind filled with pressure or expectation, just quiet spaces where conversation didn't need to prove anything. Vanessa leaned into that. She didn't ask questions that would complicate things, didn't bring up anything that required reflection. She kept things where they had always been between them. Simple. You look tired, she said one evening, watching him closely from across the table. Alexander glanced at her briefly. I've been busy, he replied. That was normal. That answer had always been enough. Vanessa nodded. She didn't push further, because pushing had never been part of how she moved. But this time, something felt slightly off, not in what he said, but in how he carried it. His attention wasn't divided the way it had been before. It wasn't pulled between two places. Now, it felt distant, like it wasn't fully present anywhere. Vanessa noticed it the second time they met that week. He arrived on time, sat across from her, answered when she spoke, but there was a delay in him, not in response time, in presence. You're quiet tonight, she said. Alexander looked up. I thought you liked that. She smiled slightly. I like when it means something. That should have shifted the moment. Before, it would have, but now, he just nodded, and the conversation moved on. That was new, because before, there had always been a rhythm between them. Now, there were breaks in it, small ones, but noticeable. Vanessa adjusted. She leaned in more during conversations, held eye contact a little longer, allowed silence to stretch just enough to invite something deeper. But nothing followed. Not resistance, not engagement, just stillness. And for the first time, that stillness didn't feel like control. It felt like absence. Vanessa didn't question it immediately, because from where she stood, she had what she thought she wanted. Alexander was there, available, consistent. There was no one else dividing his time anymore. So why did it feel different? The answer didn't come all at once. It showed itself in moments. A dinner where he left earlier than expected, not abruptly, just without extending the night. A conversation where she shared something personal, and he listened, but didn't respond beyond acknowledgement. A pause where she expected connection, and got distance instead. Vanessa sat across from him one evening, her posture relaxed but her attention sharper than usual. You've changed, she said. The words weren't heavy, just direct. Alexander didn't react immediately. He picked up his glass, took a small sip, then set it back down. I don't think I have, he replied. Vanessa studied him, not the surface, the space behind it. You're here, she said slowly, but it doesn't feel like you are. That landed, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. Alexander didn't answer right away, and that silence told her more than anything he could have said. That was the moment it shifted for her, not dramatically, because Vanessa understood something. Presence isn't just about being there. It's about being engaged, connected, and what she was experiencing now was neither. She leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged. "You don't have to explain it," she said. That mirrored something, but she didn't realize it yet. Alexander looked at her. For a second, there was something in his expression, not guilt, not confusion, something closer to realization, but it passed quickly, and that told her everything, because now she saw it clearly. This wasn't the same man she had been interacting with before, not in presence, not in energy. Something had shifted, not because of her, but before her. Vanessa sat there quietly for a moment, letting that settle, and for the first time, a thought crossed her mind that hadn't existed before. Not doubt, understanding. She hadn't taken something complete. She had stepped into something already changing, and what she had now wasn't the version she thought she had chosen. It wasn't about winning, because there was nothing to win. There was only what remained, and what remained was different, quieter, less connected. Vanessa looked at Alexander again, not with disappointment, not with frustration, but with clarity, and in that moment, she realized something she hadn't considered before. She didn't take him from Jasmine. She received him after something had already shifted, and that difference changed everything. Jasmine didn't announce her return. She didn't make it a moment. It happened the same way most important things in her life had happened. Quietly. The first weekend after she left the penthouse, she found herself back in Southeast DC, not for a reason that needed explaining, just because the streets hadn't changed. Music still carried from open windows, blending into conversations happening on sidewalks and front steps. Someone laughed loudly from across the street, the kind of laugh that didn't ask for permission to exist. Kids ran past, weaving between parked cars without slowing down. It felt familiar. Not in a nostalgic way, in a grounded way. Jasmine walked at her own pace, her steps steady, her attention moving across everything without needing to focus on anything specific. There was no tension in her shoulders, no weight in her movements, just presence. She passed a small corner store she used to stop at years ago. It was still there, still open, still part of the rhythm of the neighborhood. For a second she paused, not because she needed anything, but because she remembered. Not the details, just the feeling. And then she kept walking. That was the difference now. Memories didn't hold her in place. They passed through her. Her phone buzzed once in her hand. She glanced at it briefly. Alexander's name. No message, just a missed call. Jasmine looked at the screen for a second, then locked it. No hesitation, no second thought. And that was all it took. Because whatever that moment would have meant before, it didn't mean the same thing now. She continued walking, turning onto a quieter street where the noise softened just enough to hear her own steps. The air felt lighter, not because anything around her had changed, but because she wasn't carrying anything that needed to be resolved anymore. Later that evening, she sat outside with people who had known her long before any of this. No explanations were needed. The conversations moved easily. Stories overlapping, jokes that didn't require context. Someone nudged her lightly. "You've been quiet," they said. Jasmine smiled slightly. Just listening, that was enough, because with them, she didn't have to be anything else. As the night stretched, the sky deepened, and the city settled into a slower rhythm. Jasmine leaned back, her gaze lifting toward the distance. There was no urge to check her phone, no need to revisit anything behind her. She wasn't avoiding it. She had already moved past it. The next morning, she walked again, this time without direction, not heading somewhere specific, just moving. Each step felt deliberate, even without a destination. She passed familiar places, some unchanged, some slightly different, but none of them held her, and that mattered, because for the first time in a long time, her life didn't feel like it was shaped by something external. It felt like it belonged to her again. There was a moment, mid-step, where she slowed slightly, not stopping, just noticing the quiet in her mind, the absence of questions, the lack of anything pulling her backward. That was the victory, not loud, not visible to anyone else, but real, because she hadn't fought to keep something that no longer aligned with her. She hadn't tried to compete for attention. She hadn't needed to prove anything. She had simply chosen herself, and that choice had changed everything. As she reached the end of the street, Jasmine paused briefly at the corner, not to think, just to take in where she was. Then, she stepped forward again. No hesitation, no looking back, just movement. And for the first time, that movement wasn't influenced by anything behind her. It was entirely her own. Some endings don't come with noise. They don't arrive with clear closure or a final moment that announces itself as the last. Sometimes they happen quietly, not when the words are spoken, not when the truth is revealed, but earlier, in the small moments most people overlook. Jasmine didn't walk away because of one conversation. She didn't leave because of one confession. She had already begun leaving in the moments where things no longer felt aligned, in the pauses that didn't exist before, in the distance that didn't need to be explained. And by the time everything was said out loud, she wasn't deciding what to do. She had already decided. That's something most people don't realize until much later. That decisions like that rarely happen all at once. They build, quietly, until one day, there's nothing left to question. And when you reach that point, you don't react, you move. What made Jasmine different wasn't that she avoided emotion. It wasn't that she didn't feel the shift. She did, but she didn't allow it to control her actions. She didn't chase clarity from someone else. She didn't demand explanations that wouldn't change the outcome. She paid attention, and when things became clear, she respected that clarity. That's where most people struggle, because clarity doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it shows you things you hoped weren't true. Sometimes it confirms what you've been trying not to see. And in those moments, it's easier to ignore it, to delay it, to ask for more time. But Jasmine didn't do that. She accepted what was in front of her, without trying to reshape it into something else. And that's where her strength came from. Not from fighting, not from proving anything, but from understanding that not everything is meant to be held on to. Some things change. Some people shift, and when they do, trying to force them back into what they used to be only creates more distance. Jasmine didn't do that. She let it be what it was, and in doing that, she kept something most people lose in situations like that: herself. Alexander didn't lose Jasmine in the moment he spoke. He lost her earlier, in the moments where his attention shifted, in the choices that seemed small at the time, but weren't, because relationships don't break all at once. They change in pieces, and by the time the final piece moves, everything else has already shifted with it. Vanessa believed she had stepped into something new, but what she received wasn't the beginning. It was what remained after something else had already changed. And that's a lesson too, because what looks like an opportunity from the outside doesn't always carry the same value on the inside. In the end, there was no dramatic win, no moment where Jasmine needed to prove anything, no scene where she had to fight for her position, because her strength wasn't in holding on. It was in knowing when to let go. And that's what made the difference, because when you understand your worth, you don't need someone else to confirm it. You don't stay in situations that no longer reflect it. You don't react out of fear. You respond with clarity. Jasmine didn't win because things worked out in her favor. She won because she didn't lose herself trying to make something work that had already shifted away from her. And sometimes, that's the most powerful outcome there is. Not getting what you thought you wanted, but realizing you didn't need it to begin with. As she walked forward, no longer carrying anything behind her, there was no weight, no unfinished thoughts, no questions left unanswered, just movement. And that movement wasn't about leaving something behind. It was about stepping fully into herself, without hesitation, without doubt, just forward. If this story moved you, subscribe to Mr. Gray Family for more real stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Jasmine's plaque?